Hello and welcome. Election Day 2020. It is going down. Welcome to Burn It Down with Kim Brown. Folks, it is game time. And this is an interesting game because it's a game we already know is going to go into overtime. Of course, lots of things percolating around the country in addition to the election, but more specifically, the focus on the race for the White House as President Trump and Joe Biden make their final push to make sure that they are able to turn out the vote and have the election go in their favor. Although one of those people have already said that they don't intend to accept the results unless they win. So that already sets us up for a very interesting and long night, if not days and possibly weeks. So as we kick off here our election day coverage on Burn It Down, first of all, you have to stick with the Real News Network pretty much all night. Because we are going to be on live bringing you the latest information, updates, outcomes of not only what's going on nationally, but what's happening in individual states with a lot of very important consequential Senate races, races for attorney general, and other things in places that you definitely want to know and hear about. So, here on The Real News, we're teaming up with the good people at the Tightrope podcast, hosted by professors and doctors Trisha Rose and Cornell West. We're very excited about that. So, stay tuned here pretty much all night long, starting at 7 p.m., going until can't even tell you when we're going to stop broadcasting because we're going to go until the news stops reproducing itself, hopefully at some point in the wee hours of tomorrow morning. So it's going to be a very exciting evening. We hope that you stick with us and join us as we cover this historical, monumental American election for 2020. 2020 has been 2020ing big time this year. So coming up on Burn It Down, first of all, we want to welcome everyone that's watching. Shout out to everyone that's checking us out on Periscope. Bienvenue. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here. We want to hear from you in the chat and in the comments also. But coming up today on Burn It Down, we're going to focus on some individual places. We've kind of talked a lot about what's going on with Biden, Trump, et cetera. And I think that's pretty much been talked out at this point. Right now, it's go or showtime. But today we're going to focus on the importance and really the might of the Latinx vote, whether or not that electoral bloc can really pretty much judge the outcome, produce the outcome of not only the national election for the White House, but a lot of other races as well. The efforts that have been made in some states to disenfranchise not only the Latinx vote, but Black and Indigenous vote as well. So we're going to get into that later on. We're also going to be discussing, coming straight out of Arizona, very important race for attorney general there. I think they just call it the Maricopa attorney. I don't know if it's attorney general, but we'll get the scoop on that. But Maricopa County, if you don't have familiarity with Arizona, I mean, the first name that comes to mind is Joe Arpaio, who was the sheriff there. But the attorney general's race is very consequential as well. You have, for the first time, it will be a woman who will be holding that seat. One of them is in favor of expunging people who have marijuana arrests off their records. One of them is not. So we're going to be discussing the ins and outs and particulars of that race as well. But to get started, a lot of the eyes of the nation over the summer, during the summer of all these uprisings against police violence and against police brutality, was focused on Portland, Oregon, out there on the West Coast. Portland gained a lot of attention because of the deployment of federal officers, federal troops, federal agents. I don't think it was necessarily made clear who were on the streets there during the many months of uprisings, but there has been a pretty brutal police response to the protesters who have been taking part in the demonstrations, including the gassing of not only protesters, but city residents, where there was so much tear gas in the city of Portland that it seeped into people's homes, okay? Got people sick. I mean, it was friggin' crazy in Portland. And there's a big mayoral race. The incumbent Democrat Ted Wheeler is facing a pretty formidable challenge from progressive. Let me make sure I say her name correctly. Sarah Ayanaran. Yes, I said that right. Sarah Ayanaran has been doing a pretty interesting job challenging Ted Wheeler on a lot of his policies, including the way that the Portland police have handled the uprisings and demonstrations before that. So I'd like to join or welcome, I should say, our two guests today joining us from Portland to give us some context and some clarity of what this race means and what the general tenor is in Portland, not only today, but in the weeks prior to Election Day. So joining us today, we're joined with Cory Elia. Cory is a managing editor for Village Portland. He is a multimedia journalist focusing on protests, politics, and homelessness in Portland, Oregon. He has also been on the front lines during the uprisings in Portland during the local Black Lives Matter protests since May. Bea Lake is also joining us. Bea is a freelance journalist with the 45th Parallel Absurdist Brigade, which is such an awesome name, who has been covering the police crackdown against Black Lives Matter and anti-police protests in Portland, Oregon. Very excited to have you both joining us. Thank you both for being here today and for your dedication following the protests and demonstrations in your city over these past several months.
Thanks so much for having us.
Okay, well, I wanted us to lead off, if we could, because this is a really interesting race. And again, you know, mayoral races don't usually take a national spotlight. And I'm not sure that this one has either, given the general magnitude of not only the race for the White House, but other elections as well. But I found this one super interesting because Ted Wheeler, you know, positioned himself over the summer as someone who was perhaps standing with the protesters, speaking tough talk against Donald Trump. But when I was reading sort of the tone from social media people, activists and organizers on the ground, they weren't buying it from Ted Wheeler. They seemed to call that Ted Wheeler was basically full of shit. And I wanted to take a peek, if we could, at the mayoral debate that was sponsored by the Oregonian and KGW News, I believe back in the beginning of October. And Dwayne, I want to go to V2. And this is what Ted Wheeler had to say when he was asked about the ongoing protests in Portland, whether or not he supports either police reform and whether, I guess the question was asked, when does the line go too far from demonstrating, you know, peacefully for civil and civil rights, et cetera, to being destructive? And this is what Ted Wheeler had to say to that question.
When it comes to police reform, of course, I support police reform, and that's one of the reasons that my colleagues and I on the City Council are referring an overhaul of our accountability and oversight mechanism to the November ballot. I support it. I want you to support it because it'll help us hold cops accountable when they do things wrong.
I do have a follow-up for you, Mayor Wheeler. You've been called weak for your handling of the protests, while others have called you tear gas Ted. What's going to be different? How will things change if you're reelected?
Well, look, I get it from both sides. People saying the police are overbearing, people saying the police aren't engaging enough. And the bottom line here is you've got to draw the line carefully, because on one hand, we are going to support nonviolent and peaceful demonstration. We're going to support the First Amendment rights of people to gather and express their opinions, particularly during this time where people are really speaking out loudly for social justice and racial equity. But on the other hand, we have to do what we need to do for the police to be able to hold people accountable.
Cory, I'm going to start with you because it seems as though the issue of police accountability and police brutality obviously has taken a front and center position during this mayoral race. What are some of the concerns that people that you've spoken with in the streets, who have been out in the streets during these uprisings, what are the concerns about the mayor's previous record on police dealing with the public and how he has handled this past summer?
Wow, that's a really long question, really. So
a lot of people kind of see Mayor Wheeler as being disingenuous in a lot of the things he's been saying and he's been doing. He was in his campaign when he ran, he was specifically running on a platform of handling the homeless situation, which he never really did. It is actually seems to have gone a little bit worse. And not in the fact of, worse in the way that people are presenting themselves on the street, but the fact that more people seem to be struggling and finding themselves on the street because they are not able to sustain themselves. There's real social networks that were in place here in Portland that have been kind of eroded away over the last few years. The list is exhaustive. I could go through it, but it would take for hours probably. Yeah, a lot of people don't see Ted Wheeler as being very genuine in what he's saying he's going to do and what he does. Especially during these protests with the police, a lot of people kind of see him just sidestepping it, making excuses for police. It's really troubling to see.
Bea, what has been your observations and your reporting out in the streets over these past several months about Ted Wheeler's job performance at large?
Sure.
And then I almost feel like for most elected officials, right? Like we can talk about their tenure pre-COVID and pre-George Floyd, and then there's a post-COVID and post-George Floyd handling of their respective jurisdictions. How do you feel people believe Ted Wheeler has performed before and since, I suppose?
Right. Well, so one thing that I think it's worth noting is, as you said, Ted Wheeler tried to position himself as a sort of national counterpoint to Trump in a moment of crisis, when the fact of the matter is that he's been working closely with the Portland Police and has been acceding to the demands of the Portland Police Association, the union, for pretty much his entire tenure. He also came on when he was first elected, promising a platform of police reform and accountability. We have a number of sort of variously toothless oversight committees and boards in Portland that are supposed to monitor and rein in the excesses of the Portland Police. And historically, they've been pretty non-functional. We've had also, over the course of the last 10 years, there's a federal probe into the Portland Police's tendency to murder people in the midst of mental health crisis. And they were under federal investigation for that. They were found substantially in violation of the settlement that ended that investigation. And throughout all of that, Ted Wheeler has made a lot of sounds about addressing issues and has not tangibly done a whole lot. And that was something that could kind of fade into the background pre-George Floyd and pre-COVID. However, it's become very clear that, genuine reformers, I want to point to, council members like Joanne Hardesty and Chloe Udaley, who do seem to have a genuine interest in holding the police to account, have been struggling against obstruction by the mayor pre-George Floyd and certainly throughout the summer. We've got, most recently there was a vote that Joanne Hardesty brought up after withdrawing her endorsement. This is a Black councilwoman who had previously endorsed Ted Wheeler. She withdrew her endorsement and then is now endorsing Sarah Iannarone. And in the course of doing all this, she also voiced her frustration with the obstruction of Ted Wheeler at what seemed to be the behest of the Portland Police. And when Joanne Hardesty brought forth a measure to immediately move to defund the police, Portland Police Bureau by an additional $18 million, this is over the $15 million that had been put into place at the beginning of the summer. She and Chloe Udaley, who were both pushing for that measure, were met with obstruction on a sort of absurd level by the mayor, to the point where he was insisting that he needed an hour to move from a Zoom call city council meeting to a Zoom call debate with his challenger, and that therefore there couldn't be enough testimony and they couldn't take a vote on the defunding bill before the election. And this was in the face of Sarah Iannarone saying publicly, hey, if the mayor is having a hard time fitting this all into his schedule, we're happy to reschedule the debate because the people of Portland are demanding a bill, are demanding a vote on this measure to defund the Portland police by $18 million. So we have that. We have, again, just the sort of the history of Ted Wheeler before this point, which I mentioned as we were getting set up here. He is a registered Democrat, and that has basically been true since shortly before he began running for Portland mayor.
Well, hold on, B, let me hop in here real quick because I want to kind of set it up for the audience who may, to give some context about what we were discussing before we went live. Because I'm looking at this race being way across the country, not understanding Portland politics at all, and I see Ted Wheeler's a Democrat and Sarah Iannarone is his progressive challenger. And I asked you, B, I said, well, how come there's not a Republican challenger? And the answer is.
So the answer is that mayoral races the mayoral race in Portland is not a partisan race. It's based on who gets a certain threshold of votes in the primaries. So you have the two candidates who receive the largest number of votes in the primaries are the ones who go on to be the challengers or to be the candidates in that race. And so Ted Wheeler, also, it's important to note that another thing that has characterized his campaign is an ongoing violation of campaign finance laws that were passed with 87% in favor by Portland voters. And Ted Wheeler has been suing the city to try to prevent the city from implementing those campaign finance laws. And is now currently, I believe, suing the city attorney suing the auditor's office and trying to impel the city attorney to take up his case against a part of his own city hall. And again, the auditors attempting to hold him to the campaign finance laws that were passed with 87% majority by the voters of Portland. He also famously made, I believe it was $150,000 donation to himself, which was after he had been issued a number of fines and cease and desist orders because of his violations of campaign finance laws. And he also has generally a very small number of very large donors, whereas Sarah Iannarone has thousands upon thousands of donors who are kicking, a couple dozen, $30, something like that. And she's the only one using the public campaign financing that Portland voters implemented because she's the only one following the rules that allow her to access that funding.
All right. Well, I want us to play another clip from the debate, and I realize that time is getting away from us just a bit here. But Dwayne, I want to hear V3 and the setup question to this question during the mayoral debate to Sarah Iannarone, the progressive challenger, was that she has proposed reallocating $50 million from the Portland police budget to be reinvested in other places, mental health services, public safety investments. And this was a response to the question that she gave when asked.
I really want to lower our expenditures on tear gas. And I say that with a little bit of laughter in my voice, but not really, because it's no laughing matter that we were able to come up with $8 million in police funding to deal with these protests this summer. But we're still looking at thousands of Portlanders without shelter, even as the most traumatizing winter from a public health perspective in a century is coming our way. This is exactly what the community is talking about when they say, we want you to divest from militarized responses to public safety and reinvest meaningfully in community programs that work. So drawing down the hyper-militarized responses, the body armor, the armored vehicles, the tear gas, the rubber bullets, I don't want to see us spending our tax dollars on those those things. I want us spending them on programs that make sure all Portlanders, especially BIPOC Portlanders, feel safe no matter where they are in this city.
Well, you don't hear politicians talking like that very often, especially ones that are in competitive races. Cory, how big an issue was tear gas to Portlandiers this summer and for this election, and the police response generally to not only the Black Lives Matter protesters, but then the other sort of groups that sort of grew out of that movement? I'm thinking about the Wall of Moms. I'm not really sure what came of that. But how big of an issue is it going to be for people voting for the mayor's race? The way that Portland police dealt with the uprisings there in your city?
Okay, so there has been a massive amount of tear gas that has been used over these protests. I'm not sure exactly who's tracking the number of canisters used, but I know it's well over probably 1,000 by now. It's been insane. There's been so many different people trying to provide gas masks for individuals within the group community. There's even like a group named Team Raccoon that's providing gas masks for children because that's usually not really much of an option. And people, kids specifically, have been exposed to this tear gas in some of the neighborhoods during some of these direct actions. Officers are using the tear gas during those direct actions more so than it seems like they would downtown sometimes. There have been people that have complained left and right about their house being tear gassed in the middle of the evening while they were having dinner, weren't expecting it, having to run to their windows because of it as they're choking just to close the windows and trying to seal themselves in the house. It's been a thing. A lot of the protesters on the front lines right now have gotten themselves at least some form of a respirator or gas mask. And are looking into like eye protection, full face gas masks, just to be able to still be out there and protest and have their voices heard. But, well, behind gas masks, they're a little bit muffled now. So it's been really interesting to see how officers have been using tear gas, and more specifically, there's like 4 or 5 different forms of tear gas that they can use. And there's specific ones that have been banned from use, and so they're just relying more on the other forms, and they're still just using tear gas. It's just a thing. You have seen officers kind of relying once in a while when they're leaving a scene on the riot bands on a mix of like safe smoke, which is just a smoke grenade pretty much, and tear gas, and a lot of the times you can't tell which is which. And people are sitting there and not realizing it's tear gas and getting hit by it because they're not expecting it.
I'm sorry, Cory. Continue. I'm sorry, my bad.
You're fine. I was saying it's been a thing.
In the pictures that first of all, we have been covering the protests in Portland really all summer, and just some of the most stunning video of police brutality that came out of all of these uprisings across the country. Bea, I'm gonna kick the last question to you. How does it look? What are Sarah's chances? And I'm so sorry to keep blanking on her name because I can see it in my head one way, but it's pronounced like a whole nother different way. Iannarone. What are Sarah Iannarone's chances of actually upsetting incumbent Ted Wheeler in this mayoral race?
I think that's a really good question. And I think polling in this has been very tricky and has been all over the board, showing anything from a neck and neck race to the challenger Sarah Iannarone with about an 11-point lead. And again, it seems like anytime I see 3 studies or 2 or 3 different polls and they have that wide of a margin, I feel like we don't really know. We don't know how this is going to go. What I do know is that I personally have been tear gassed by the feds in the same tear gas clouds as both of the mayoral candidates. And in the case of Sarah Iannarone, she was there as part of the Wall of Moms. She was wearing a helmet. She had appropriate gear. She had eye protection. She had a face mask. And she didn't. I didn't know she was there until later. Once the feds pushed, there was a call out on social media from folks who were worried about her. Meanwhile, Ted Wheeler, he came in with bodyguards, not appropriate eye protection, not appropriate mask, stood in a cloud of tear gas for a photo op and got very thoroughly tear gassed and seemed surprised after months of his police before the feds arrived tear gassing Portlanders. He seemed very surprised at what the effects of tear gas were on himself after staging what was clearly meant to be a sort of campaign photo op. I also think it's really important to note that when we talk about the way that he has treated protesters, specifically with response to tear gas, I was present when several thousand people were addressing Ted Wheeler in a park when he came out to do a sort of community engagement early on in these protests, way before the feds arrived. And he was put to the question by community activists, BIPOC community leaders, saying like, your police have been extensively, and he's the police commissioner. This is also important to note. He's the mayor and the police commissioner. He's been asked to relinquish the commissionership and give it to Joanne Hardesty, who's a reform-minded commissioner. And he has refused. But before all of that, he was asked as police commissioner, will you ban the use of tear gas? That's something he can just do. He's the police commissioner. And on that particular night, when thousands of people were standing around him saying, we are worried we are about to be subject to violence from the Portland police, will you use your power as commissioner to restrain your police force? And his answer was, I don't like tear gas, and I will ban the use of tear gas starting tomorrow. And then his police moved in and tear gassed the absolute bejesus out of that entire park and everybody in it shortly after he left. And that is something that people of Portland, I think, are going to remember. And similarly, his ban on tear gas was a ban on the use of tear gas, of CS gas, one type of tear gas, unless there is a declared riot. It's worth noting that over this entire summer of protests, before that ban was in place, the police had declared, I believe, one riot on the first night when a large crowd directly, moved on the Portland Justice Center and, smashed the windows. There was, fireworks being set off inside of buildings. In some cases, you could accurately categorize it as a riot. That was the only riot that had been declared that I'm aware of up until that point. Once he told his police that they needed to declare a riot in order to use CS gas, suddenly the police were declaring riots nearly every night for no cause that I could discern standing on the front lines or that other folks in the collective have been able to discern. At one point, they declared a riot after people had dragged a mattress into the street and were jumping on it. And that was all that was happening. People were chanting and they were jumping on a mattress. And the event was declared a riot and tear gas was deployed. So,
well, listen, B, I'm sorry, and I apologize for cutting you off, but unfortunately,
totally
we have run out of time. But I want to thank the both of you for making some time to join us and bring us up to speed on what I feel is a pretty important and consequential race. It's sort of the former Republican, now establishment Democrat, facing off against a formidable progressive challenger in Sarah Iannarone. So I think this is fascinating what's going on in Portland, in addition to everything else that occurred in your city over the past several months. So I definitely want to thank you both, and maybe we can even check in with you later to see what the outcome of this mayoral race is out there in Portland, Oregon. We've been speaking with Bea Lake, freelance journalist from the 45th Parallel Absurdist Brigade, also Cory, Elia, managing editor for The Village Portland, multimedia journalist. Both have been covering the Portland uprisings from the beginning for several months. So we definitely, as journalists, independent journalists, freelance journalists, we want to thank you guys very much for your work and for your service. And thank you for making time for us today.
Thanks so much. It was great to be here.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Well, gang, in addition to a very important mayoral race happening in Portland, Oregon, now we're going to shift slightly east, southeast, that is, well, technically in the southwest. Arizona, a very pivotal, contested state that has national implications, of course, for the White House, whether or not Joe Biden can take Arizona, which a lot of people seem to think that Arizona is absolutely in play for the Democrats, but it's a little tested. And then there's a very important Senate race. But then when we get down a little bit more to the nuts and bolts, it's a very important race for an elected position, which many people who have been advocating in the movement for Black Lives say that we need to pay attention to who the prosecutors are in our respective areas that we live. And this is most important in a place like Maricopa County, which has a not so good reputation for incarcerating tremendous amounts of Black and brown people, in addition to treating them rather brutally upon incarceration. And there's an interesting race going on right now. Maricopa County attorney, the next one, whoever will be elected, will be a woman. It is between Alistair Adel and Julie Gunnagle. And to help us make some sense of this race, I am so happy to welcome to the program right now Analise Ortiz. Analise is a campaign strategist at the ACLU of Arizona. Analise is joining us. She's also a leading nonpartisan campaign to educate voters about the Maricopa County attorney's election. Yes, and the role prosecutors have playing in making Arizona one of the top incarcerators in the nation. Analise, thank you so much for being here on Burn It Down.
Of course, Kim. Thanks for having me.
Before we get into the particulars of this very important race, can you talk to us about Maricopa County and its history of how it engages the community via law enforcement and via the criminal justice system, because it doesn't really have the best reputation on those fronts?
Oh, yeah. I'm a lifelong Arizonan. And, you know, when people think of Arizona, I think they largely think of Joe Arpaio, the former Maricopa County sheriff. Joe Arpaio had some severely racist policies, and he left a really dark scar, not only on Maricopa County, but on the whole state, that we are still trying to overcome. Really the culture of being overly punitive, of not investing in communities or in rehabilitation. And when we talk about Joe Arpaio, usually, you know, the Maricopa County Attorney's Office is kind of left out of the conversation. However, during Arpaio's reign, the county attorney's office was right there, helping in some of these human rights abuses that he committed. And so the county attorney's office, which is the district attorney or the prosecutor's office, is the third largest in the nation. And it too has a very long history of racial disparities and injustice that unfortunately has made Arizona a top incarcerator in the entire country.
So let's get into who these women are and what they represent here, because I was sort of doing some research on social media about this race, and I came across, I'm going to tell you 1 second, Dwayne, pop up T4 if you could. I popped up this tweet, and I was a little disturbed by the tweet, I have to say. PDX Law Girl tweeted on November 1st, gang enhancement in charging are notoriously racially biased and overly broad. Maricopa County Attorney Alistair Adel is now charging some police protesters as gang members. This is a choice she is making. Prosecutors have discretion in charging, and people can vote her out. And she quote tweeted from Dave Biscobing, who I believe is a reporter there in Phoenix, and he reported, so Maricopa County Attorney Office is now charging some police protesters as gang members, which is a serious from a criminal and constitutional standpoint. Of course, Analise, I know you are fully aware of this. What is the ACLU's take? I would imagine it was a bit of horror when you realized that the Attorney General, Alistair Adel, is taking this position when it comes to prosecuting protesters.
Absolutely. So the ACLU of Arizona has actually been in an ongoing lawsuit with the Phoenix Police Department over protesters' rights in a protest that happened shortly after Trump was elected. What we see here is that the Phoenix Police Department goes very hard when there's protesters. They use chemical weapons. They make arrests without having probable cause that end up getting dismissed in court. And the ACLU stance is that this is really chilling free speech. And so when we saw that some of those protesters who were being arrested by the Phoenix Police Department were then later being charged by the Maricopa County Attorney's Office with a gang enhancement, we were incredibly concerned because we absolutely see this as an overreach. During that hearing that the reporter referenced, the prosecutor argued that they used the gang enhancement because the person was wearing all black and because they were carrying an umbrella. Now, those are that's hardly evidence of anything other than folks organizing to make their voices heard during a pivotal moment in our country and a pivotal moment for police brutality. And Phoenix has one of the deadliest police departments in the nation. So it's incredibly important that the county attorney's office stops this. We want to see them dismiss these charges. We do see this as towing the line of political prosecutions. And definitely post-election, folks should feel like they will not be arrested on baseless grounds just for practicing their First Amendment rights.
So when it comes to criminal justice reform, the challenger, Julie Gunnigal, has proposed expunging the records of marijuana offenders, if I have that correct. But she's also received the endorsement of a lot of progressive organizations and grassroots organizations. What is her stance, or how does she contrast to Alistair Adel?
So the ACLU of Arizona does not endorse or oppose candidates. We are completely nonpartisan. We have been leading a voter education campaign, and part of that campaign included, asking of very firm commitments from both Alistair Adel and Julie Gunnigal. One thing that we saw early on was that Julie Gunnigal made a commitment to reduce Arizona's prison population by 26%, which would bring Arizona in line with the national average. Adele did not make a similar commitment. She would not make a decarceration goal. And we like to see a decarceration goal because whatever these candidates say on the campaign trail, we want to be able to hold them accountable, right? So we want to see measurable goals. And then, like you mentioned with marijuana, Gunnigal has made a few commitments related to ending the prosecutions of low-level marijuana offenses. We did ask for Adele to make those same commitments and unfortunately did not receive pledges from her to do so. So those are just a couple of the issues that are really at play here in the Maricopa County Attorney's race.
And Analise, as we talk about the consequences of incarceration, of locking people up, and we understand that Maricopa County, unfortunately, boasts some of the most brutal conditions for people who are incarcerated there in the state of Arizona. What are some of the steps that the ACLU is urging either lawmakers or organizing people in Arizona to take action about that particular issue, to get people out of jail, as it were, and to stop more people from going to jail?
Absolutely. So we have, our campaign is called the Smart Justice Campaign. Our main goal is to reduce the prison population by 50% and to challenge racism within the legal system. We do that through three ways. And the first is, prosecutor reform, educating the public about prosecutors, and the voter education we've been doing in this county attorney race is really part of that focus on decarceration and bringing Arizona down from the harm that it's caused to communities for so long. So we want to see, county attorneys making really bold commitments to invest in our communities, invest in diversion, as opposed to always thinking of prison as the first response. And then secondly, we also are pushing for sentencing reform at the state capitol. Arizona is one of the only states where everyone has to serve 85% of their sentence, regardless of the progress they make in prison. So we've been trying for the past few years to pass a bill that would allow people to earn time off their sentence if they participate in programming while incarcerated. And of course, with COVID, the legislative session ended abruptly this year. So next year, we expect to be right back at the state capitol fighting for sentencing reform as well.
Absolutely. Well, we want to thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us about this very important race in Arizona. Maricopa County, so pivotal and crucial for Black and Indigenous people of color. And obviously, whoever becomes the next attorney. How come it's not Attorney General, by the way? Would you mind answering that for me?
So we have an Attorney General, but they don't handle the prison aspect, and the aspect of charging people and sending them to prison is the responsibility and falls in the jurisdiction of the county attorneys. So we have a county attorney for each county. And so it's an incredibly powerful role. And I think part of the fact that it's not a super common name, it's not district attorney, it's not attorney general, is what's really allowed county attorneys to fly under the radar for so long and get away with a lot of these abuses. And so, that was one of our goals this year, was let's elevate the awareness and let voters really know what their county attorney does so they can make an informed choice when they go into that polling booth or mail back their ballot.
Yes, I think this is extremely important. And I definitely want to thank the ACLU of Arizona for making sure to highlight the importance of these kinds of offices, of people who are in the streets. If you are advocating for on behalf of Black and Indigenous lives and against police brutality, you kind of have to know who the top cops are in your respective areas. And this is so important for your organization and for others to highlight this race. And we hope that Black and Indigenous people win and Latinx people win. That's who we want to win tonight. So we want to thank Analise Ortiz for joining us. She is a campaign strategist at the ACLU of Arizona. Thank you so much for making some time for us, Analise. Best of luck tonight.
Of course. Thanks, Kim. Take care.
All right, everybody. So we are still rolling along here on Burn It Down. We're waiting for our final guest to join us. But I want to thank everyone that's taken the time to watch us on Periscope. And do not forget, baby, tonight it is going down starting. Yes, listen, Breezy is so excited. Starting at 7 o'clock, going all the way until probably well past midnight. The real news is here for your election night headquarters. That is us. Watch us, be with us, and not just us, be with Trisha Rose, Cornell West from the Tightrope. They will be bringing loads and loads of folks on to discuss what's happening in local areas and what's happening nationally. Of course, we are unlikely to know what the outcome of the race for the White House is going to be by the end of tonight. With all states taking different approaches to how they count the absentee and mail-in ballots. For example, the state of Florida has been counting them all along, whereas the state of Pennsylvania will not even begin to count the mail-in and absentee ballots until the polls close. This could be an interesting week for the United States as a whole. But as I mentioned, there are other races that are likely going to be decided tonight. I know Breezy is just bubbling over with rage about what tonight's outcomes could possibly be. But we're watching a number of Senate races, including in Arizona, South Carolina, extremely important. And again, other races for other offices, like we just discussed with Analise, Maricopa County Attorney position up for grabs, in addition to the mayoral race out there in Portland. So please be with us, the real news and the Tightrope, through at least midnight, 1 a.m. We could go until 6 a.m. It could be that kind of evening, y'all. So we would appreciate y'all joining us and staying with us all night. We will have your late breaking results as well, up to the minute. Don't go to one of the cable networks because you think they got it. No, we got it. We got it. Are we ready to move along? Dwayne? Possibly so. Okay, wonderful. Okay. Oh, there's comments to read. That is amazing. And I want to thank everyone that has found us. Look at that. y'all, we have a new producer. I mean, y'all hear me reference Dwayne all the time. Dwayne does his technical thing, but we have an other producer. Her name is Genevieve, kicking ass, taking names. All right, we got some comments. So, Vigular72 says the government begets more government until it considers people its property that it needs to be taken care of until it finds some arbitrary reason to kill and stack tens of millions of its property. I guess, I mean, when not what slavery was? Are you suggesting we're back in slavery, sir? Democracy is mob rule, garage government is antiquated and dumb. Thanks for your comments. Speaker is speaking. Paul X, BOG, here we go. Analise just spoke lots of important factors. Yes, she did. I appreciate organizations like the ACLU and what they do. I guess maybe, I don't know what their, tax filing status is, but I totally think the ACLU should be endorsing people, but the ACLU kind of doesn't care what I think, so that's fine. Cryptician in the comments says, burn it down with Kim Brown, Trisha Rose, Cornell West, nothing but the best. That's right, rhyme form, baby. Dr. West loves when you spit some of that hot fire lyric on him, because Dr. West is a big music fan. So I'm definitely looking forward to checking out Dr. Rose and Dr. West for the tightrope and all they are going to bring to tonight's coverage and election coverage. So, oh, wonderful. Okay. So you guys, a lot of factors are coming into this race, including COVID first and foremostly. Obviously, the issues of voter suppression are a big issue. And then when we look at how demographic voting blocks are going to break in this election, we know that Donald Trump has made a concerted effort, I suppose. I don't really know how concerted it is, to be truthful, but he has opened his mouth and words have come out to the effect that he wants the Hispanic Latinx vote to break for him. And in some places, that might be true. And what people need to understand is that the Latinx voting bloc is absolutely not a monolith. I don't believe that 90% of Latinos vote in a certain direction or vote for a certain candidate, unlike African Americans. And I know we've had this discussion plenty about the diverse nature of Black politics from the left. But when it comes down to it, Black people are more likely to vote Democrat. And while that may be the case for the Latinx voting bloc as well, not as many. And the Republicans are able to siphon off significant amounts. But without a doubt, they could be the deciding factor in today's elections, not just for the White House, but in races across the country. And joining us today, I'd like to welcome Tania Unzueta. Tania, if I'm not pronouncing your name right, please correct me. Tania is the political director for Mijente. Tania is a first-generation Mexican immigrant and fierce advocate for the rights of the undocumented around the country. And before Mijente, she helped found 2 organizations that defend the rights of immigrants, including Organized Communities Against Deportation and its predecessor, the Immigrant Youth Justice League. Tania, thank you so much for joining us and making some time for us today on Burn It Down. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Do you pronounce your last name? Is it Unzueta?
Close, Unzueta.
Unzueta. Thank you very much. I appreciate your patience for that. So let's talk about, let's start with the race for the White House, I suppose, because the Trump campaign, when I say they've made overtures, again, I don't know specifically what kind of overtures the Trump campaign actually makes besides saying, hey, Latinos, y'all should vote for us, right? In terms of policy, they don't really have a wonderful track record, but at the same time, that has not stopped them from trying to spin the fact that they feel as though they have an opportunity to win a significant part of the Latinx vote. I want to put up, if we could, Dwayne, a tweet from Yamiche Alcindor, the journalist from PBS. She covers the White House extensively. Yamiche put up a fact-checking tweet. If we could get that up, Dwayne, please. There we go. So Trump was in Florida and he said, quote, we are now, according to the polls shown, which say which are real polls, that we are now beating the Democrats for the first time ever with Hispanic Americans. And Yamiche Alcindor goes on to fact check and says Biden is leading Trump among Latinos in several states, including Florida, Nevada, Texas, and Arizona. So let's talk about this, if we could, for a moment, Tanya, because there have been some indications that at least portions of the Latino vote are going to go to Donald Trump. But could Latinos actually swing this election the other direction in favor of Joe Biden? What's it looking like to you and from people that you've been speaking with and organizing with?
I completely agree with you that it's an issue of the Latino community not being a monolith. I mean, I'll start with saying that a majority of folks, I think some of the polls have us at like 75%, 70, I think it's like closer to 70% of Latinos that are supporting Biden clearly, and the 30 to 35% that are still with Trump. And the thing is, there's a very particular like historical context for some of the Latinos who tend to side more with the Republican Party. And a lot of these folks are particularly coming from countries where there's been a tumultuous history, to say the least, with left-leaning governments, particularly Venezuela, Cuba. And so when they come to the United States, there's a very, like, the thing that Trump has done is told people, you know, that Venezuelan government that you didn't like over there? Well, Democrats are socialists, and they might as well be this, like, Venezuelan president that you ran away from. And so what we see a lot of times on the doors is people being really uninformed about what the policies actually are and what Republicans and Democrats actually stand for. But when we start telling people, you know, like, have you seen how Trump is actually acting kind of dictatorial? Like, the thing that you didn't like about some of these governments is that you didn't feel like democracy was being respected, like opposition was being respected. And some of it is kind of pointing out, like, Trump is the one who's closer to an authoritarian government than any of the Democratic candidates we have, and particularly Biden. So some of it has been sort of fixing like that, like propaganda that has just been invested in by the Republicans, particularly in places like Florida, where that tweet was coming from. But honestly, I think across the board, a lot of our folks are, particularly young people who are coming out in greater numbers than we've seen in prior elections, are voting for Biden, voting particularly against Trump and all the stuff that he has done. And we're seeing this across the board from Arizona, where we have some of our folks who've been working there for a long time, to some of the more newer places where, like, the Latino community is barely emerging, like Georgia and North Carolina.
I want to get back to one of your earlier points there, Tanya, and I wanted to take a look at this clip from, forgive me, of all places, Laura Ingraham show, okay, from Fox News. And I apologize for sullying your beautiful eyeballs with this mess, I should say. But I saw this clip and I thought it was interesting, and I wanted to play it for you. So, Dwayne, away we go.
Hispanics are poised to play a big role. We just heard from the famous UFC fighter down in that Miami bar, or Arizona, Nevada, Florida. So what did you find when you were on the trail?
Laura, in Florida, a new Telemundo poll has Trump at 43% and Biden at 48% among Hispanics. Now, remember, Hillary got 62% of that vote in 2016. So I asked Latino voters this week in Tampa, why are they swinging toward Trump? Here's what they said.
Most of the Latinos that we probably have here in the Tampa Bay and Florida have been through the Castro regime, Venezuela, and they see what's going on, and they don't want the same for the country. Like I said, the Democrat Party is too far away to the left, and their ideas on abortion and on the economy, it seems like it's just not going to work.
Why do I think it's closer? I think that Latinos and African Americans and all voters, bottom line, they vote their pocketbook just like every other voter. And their pocketbook says Trump.
No Desposito there, Laura. Latinos and African American men are shifting. They like Trump's strength. They like his leadership. And if he wins this election, it will be in part because of those two groups.
Interesting take there, Tanya. You know, It is really interesting to me, and I want to get your opinion here about some sort of perhaps intra community dynamics, because I hear what perhaps some Cuban immigrants or perhaps Venezuelan immigrants or people who may not have had a good experience originally before immigrating here to the U.S. So I can understand perhaps their reluctance to adopt what they call socialism policies, even though Joe Biden is not advocating such policies. But what's interesting to me is that I wonder if the white Latinx community's politics differ from like Afro Latinx people or people who are perhaps more visually identifiable as Latino, and because Donald Trump has had targeted racist policies towards the Latino community at large. But again, these not insignificant chunks of the conservative part of the demographic double down for Donald Trump and are trying to encourage others to go for Trump, as noted in a recent LA Times article that is really, really interesting read. What can you explain some of the community dynamics that perhaps people who are outside of the community may not be understanding what they are seeing?
Yeah, I sort of smile because I'm like that's like trying to explain racism too. But I mean, it is the reality that the Latino community is multiracial. As you mentioned, we have folks who are indigenous, who are Latinx, who are mixed, who are Black, who are brown, who are white, and as you might expect, folks who are lighter skin have a very different experience in this world and in this country when it comes to everything that we already know impacts your experience in this country, from jobs to police violence. And I'm obviously not an Afro Latinx woman. I don't know what the experience of living as a Black woman in the U.S. is, but what we've hear consistently is that as the experience with Black Americans, Black Afro Latinos are also experiencing what it is like to be Black in this country. And so I don't know. So all that to say, I do think whiteness and white Latinos come with a certain amount of privilege. And, I don't know. I haven't seen stats that sort of break down whether it's like the white Latinx folks who are more likely to be in support of Trump, but there's definitely a correlation between folks who are lighter skinned, folks who have more money, folks who are coming into the United States with more privilege already that tend to lean Republican than tend to lean towards Trump. And that sort of matches what we see in other communities and in other groups where the folks who have more money and see interest in someone like Trump being president tend to spend their resources in supporting those candidates. And then I think there's just also people who are misinformed. And I think they're, we know that the tactic that Trump has used has been divide and conquer. And whether it's divide and conquer between like Latinx people and folks who are not Latinx, or be like amongst like Black and brown Latinx people ourselves, like the strategy is divide and conquer. And so they spend a lot of money, they spend a lot of resources in making sure that what we're hearing constantly is divisive. And like, I mean, there's just ways in which people are pitted against each other in very basic ways. And that's, again, I think both like intra-community and amongst our communities too.
And I wanted to bring that point as sort of one of the final things that we hit. Interesting article has been floating around from NPR, and other outlets are reporting on this as well, about Black and Latinx communities being targeted for voter disinformation. And I think the NPR headline is Black and Latino voters flooded with disinformation in elections' final days. And the article goes on to detail campaigns allegedly coming through from Russians and other foreign actors who seek to destabilize the Black and Brown participation in this election. But when we look historically, even in the not so distant past for 2016, 90% of Black voters broke for Donald Trump. Upper 70s percentage broke. I'm sorry, 90% of Black voters broke for Hillary Clinton, not for Donald Trump. Most of Latinx voters voted also for Hillary Clinton. It was, the white vote that was not as decisive. If 75% of white people voted against Donald Trump, chances are Donald Trump would not be president. If 90% of white people voted against Donald Trump, chances are Donald Trump would not be president. Do you feel as though the Latinx community is vulnerable to misinformation or disinformation campaigns? Or do you feel as though, the framing of sort of these targeted efforts from foreign actors are, I guess, stereotyping Black and Brown voters as sort of low information when the actual data seems to prove otherwise? What is your take on that?
Honestly, I think it's a mixture of things, and some of the variables, or I think one of the big variables is how much other information outside of the misinformation communities are receiving. And so what I've seen is that in places like Arizona, like Chicago, that have a diverse set of information sources, have community organizations, have been invested in by the Democratic Party. Like it's a little bit more balanced. I think people have more sources of information. But in places where campaigns have never knocked on people's doors, where the Latino community has never been a priority. And we saw this we worked pretty hard in North Carolina this year, and we're literally talking to people who had never had a political campaign knock on their door, a political campaign or an organization. And so I think in places like that where you're investing, where the only investment really in that community is the misinformation and the divide and conquer, I do think it has an impact. And I don't think the Democratic Party has done enough to really invest in trying to reach those people, or maybe even I would say prioritizing the Latino community. And it's why my organization and other organizations have really taken it upon ourselves to say somebody needs to be making sure that the Latino community isn't believing these lies and isn't being racist and isn't voting for Trump. And so and at the same time, it's not enough. We're community organizations. We're doing our best and trying to cover some of these gaps in a lot of places. But I do think it's about sort of the balance, right, of information that exists on the other side.
Absolutely. Well, we will see how this all ends up shaking out. Hopefully, some races to be decided tonight and the race for the White House to be decided in the very near future. But I'm certain that the Latinx vote is going to help decide a number of things. And that voting bloc continues to just grow in number with, I believe, every 30 seconds, a Latinx child turns 18, comes of age to vote in this country. So in the future, the voting bloc continues to be something to be courted and is formidable at the same time. So thank you very much for bringing us some insight and perspective to our election day coverage, Tania. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. We'll stay tuned.
Yes, we've been speaking with Tania Unzueta, the political director for Mijente. Tania, we appreciate you joining us again. Listen, everybody, that is our time here on Burn It Down, but it's not the last that you are going to see of me tonight. I'm going to be joining all of our Real News journalists and correspondents. We will be keeping you up to the minute for Election Day coverage now into election night. Our own Aman Azar and Cameron Granadino are in downtown Washington, D.C. in proximity to the White House, which, of course, has been fortified with its own brand new wall and perhaps 250 National Guard troops. should be an interesting night. Stephen Janice and Taya Graham from Police Accountability Report are going to be reporting from Pennsylvania, a very crucial swing state for both Joe Biden and Donald Trump if they hope to secure a path to electoral victory. And I'll be on a little bit later with my colleagues, Lisa Snowden McCrae, Maximilian Alvarez, Steve Horn, Mark Steiner, Andrew Corkery. I'm sure there's lots of people that I perhaps am forgetting. And don't forget, we are definitely teaming up with the Tightrope. So be sure to tune into the Real News YouTube channel starting at 7 o'clock to check out Doctors Cornell West and Trisha Rose and their wonderful slate of guests who will be joining us all night long. So tune in here 7 p.m. for the Real News Election Night 2020 coverage. You don't want to miss it. I'm your host, Kim Brown, for the Burn It Down with Kim Brown Show. We will see y'all on Friday, and I will see y'all later. Thank y'all for coming out. See y'all later. Bye. We'll see you later. Bye.